Welcome back to our study of Firm Foundations, Creation to Christ. We are now just about at the end of our study, just a few more lessons. This lesson is number 47, and we're going to see, I'll explain in a second, we're going to break it up in two parts. First of all, just a little bit of review from previous lessons. Who instigated religious leaders to have Jesus arrested? That was our previous lesson. He came into Jerusalem. He was taken captive, you could say, arrested by the Jewish leaders of the temple. Not by the Romans immediately, but the actual authorities, but by the Jewish leaders. Who was behind that? Well, the answer is Satan, an individual being or beings, demons that follow him, moving people against God's plan. And we saw in a previous lesson, John chapter 13, where it says that Satan put it into the heart of Judas to betray him, to hand him over. So these entities, Satan, in this case Satan himself, influencing people, moving people, trying to distract them from what's right, trying to get them to do things against the will of God. And that's what is working here behind these people. They went to the extreme, and we can see this is the kind of work that Satan does. Why were the religious leaders determined to have Jesus put to death? In a previous lesson, there was a conversation between Jesus and these religious leaders, and Jesus made himself equal with God. He said, "You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power." And they asked him who he was, and he responded with the I am. I am the Son of God. I am the Christ. And that all by itself was communicating that he was making himself equal with God. And these religious leaders, like we mentioned in the previous question, moved by Satan. Paul refers to these people dedicated to their own religion and not following and living for God from the heart. Paul called them the synagogue of Satan. And we have all kinds of instructions about his kind of work. The synagogue of Satan, that's who these people were. Driven by their own desires, driven by the desires of the greatest enemy of God. What were some of the prophecies that were fulfilled when Jesus was tried before the religious leaders and then Pilate? We saw in a previous lesson these religious leaders brought all kinds of false accusations, testimonies that not even two agree with each other. And then they took him to Pilate because they didn't have the authority to do what they really wanted to do, and that was to kill him. But many of the things that were written in the Old Testament were fulfilled in these hours of the life of Jesus. The false witnesses would tell lies about him. And we saw that in our prophecy chart. We're going to look at that again in this lesson. He would be hit and he'd be spit upon. Written hundreds of years previously, this would happen to him. He would be silent when falsely accused. Another thing, written ages before. The Jews would hate him without reason and reject him. They'd hate him without actual reason of having done something wrong. Their reason was that they were jealous of him. The crowds followed him, and they feared the Romans because they were given some position of somewhat of authority underneath the Romans, and they didn't want to lose that position. And Jesus threatened that they'd be removed from their place, so he couldn't control this Jesus from rising to some kind of power in their mind. So many things were fulfilled about Jesus in this hour, these hours that were written by prophets that through whom God spoke. And we have the written record of it. The written record of the prophecy and the written record of the fulfillment of these promises from God. And this lesson, Jesus was crucified, buried, and raised from the dead. In that title there, and then the life of Jesus, his life, his death, crucifixion, the fact that he was buried, he actually did die, and he was raised from the dead, that is the gospel. That is the good news. And this lesson, number 47, originally developed as a long lesson. And so I've decided to go ahead and break it up in two parts because there's so many things we're going to consider in this. So I'm going to take that risk. I'm going to break it up in two parts so it's not so much of so many concepts to take in just one sitting, because even I struggle to teach that in a reasonable amount of time. So I'm breaking it up so we can take a little bit of time and relax a little bit and not have to move so fast. But this gospel, this good news, is found in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1 through 4. And it's comprised of the life of Jesus, his death, his burial, and his resurrection from the dead. That's the good news for us, and that's what we need to understand. How is this good news for us? And that's exactly what we're going to see in this lesson. This is the focal point of all of history, the focal point of God completing his plan that he started right from Adam and Eve, right from Genesis in the garden. God completes his plan, makes a plan, and he delivers on it. Delivers a man in his plan from their biggest problem. And everything that we've studied so far leads up to this moment in history. People in the Old Testament look forward to this moment. They didn't understand all the details, but they were believing God. He was going to come through in his promise and deliver that one who would crush Satan's head, that one who would be the blessings of all nations, like we saw from the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, 15 and 17. Various times it's repeated. This is the time. This is the moment in history. And how people respond to what we're going to see in this lesson determines where people will spend eternity. Whether they are in agreement with God or whether they were opposed to God. So Jesus is arrested, been tried, an illegal process, and they took him to be crucified. They took him to a place called Golgotha, a place outside of the city of Jerusalem, to crucify him. And crucifixion was the Roman means of execution. It was the death penalty. It was reserved for the most serious crimes. And this death was very slow. Often took days for a person to actually die. And it's even now, it's considered one of the most brutal forms of execution. It's suffering, it's torture, it's agony for hours and sometimes days. In Mark 15, 20-22, it says, "And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. It's a rock formation outside of the old city of Jerusalem that looked like a skull. It was the rock formation, thus the name. Outside of the city, just to the north. Remember before, to the right side of that map, we said Gethsemane. That's the place where Jesus prayed with the disciples. He was there arrested, taken it before the religious rulers of Jerusalem, and then before Pilate, the Roman governor. And then he was taken out to the north side of the city to be crucified by the Romans under the order of Pilate, but from the pressure of the people. And he kind of conceded to go ahead and crucify Christ because he didn't find any guilt in him. Released Barabbas, and Jesus was to be killed. Mark 15:23 says, so he took him to be crucified. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. This wine mixed with myrrh was a substance to use to dull pain. But it also, like alcohol and other drugs, would dull the mind. It was an act of mercy by women, kind of a sedative drink to help dull the pain of those being crucified. Somewhat dull the pain because it was still agony and torture. But Jesus refused it. Jesus was going to go through this with a clear mind. He wasn't going to take something that would dull his mind. He kept his mind clear. That's the point of it, saying he refused it. And in Mark 15:24, it says, "And they crucified him, and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. They crucified him." Well, and realize this is after he was whipped, mercilessly whipped by things that ripped the flesh off your back, and then crucified. Nailed giant steel stakes driven through his hands into a wooden beam. Steel stake driven into his feet to hold him to the cross. Imagine the torture of that. They nailed him to this wooden cross. And years before this moment, God moved King David to write that the deliverer, the promised one's hands and feet would be pierced. And God moved through David to write that about something about the future. In Psalm 22:16 it says, "For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and my feet." And again, we're looking at prophecy, things written hundreds of years before, and how Jesus fulfilled them. Psalm 22:16, his hands and his feet pierced, fulfilled in Mark 15:24. And Jesus was lifted up, crucified. Remember the conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus? He says, as Moses is lifted up, the brazen serpent on a pole in the wilderness, that Jesus too had to be lifted up, that sinners could be saved from the punishment of sin. Now, in this picture on the screen, these people were saved from snake bites. And what did they have to do to be cured from the snake bites? Well, they had to believe the word of Moses, his instruction that he received from God, and then they looked. Belief, look to this, and they were healed. And Jesus used that moment in history to talk about what he was going to do. And this lifting up of the serpent is the same thing of Jesus being lifted up. And what do we have to do to be cured of our problem, our sin problem, the cured from being separated from God for eternity? Well, first of all, we have to believe that God did this. We have to believe what he said about it. And we have the opportunity to see and understand Jesus' words on the cross. I mean, during his whole life, about what was going to happen to him, and then seeing it happen, or reading about it having happened from the people who were actually eyewitnesses. And what do we do to be saved from that? Well, first of all, we have to believe it's true and look to Jesus. Our focus is Jesus. He was lifted up to take care of our problem for us, to heal our true problem that separates us from God. Psalm 22:18 says, so that verse we just read from Mark is, they crucified him and they cast lots for his garments. In Psalm 22:18, David again wrote, almost 1,000 years earlier, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. David was communicating, God was communicating through David so many years previously, and it was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Mark 15:24. Where it says, casting lots for his garments to decide what each would take. Gamble for his clothes in 22:18, fulfilled in Mark 15:24. Then Mark chapter 15 goes on, 25 and 26. It says, and it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. Now, the inscription of the charge above, there was an inscription placed above Jesus' head. And in the Gospel of John, we are told that it was Pilate who ordered this inscription that be attached above Jesus' head. And normally, this sign placed up there would be a list of the crimes that the person had committed, the one who's being crucified. But with Jesus, it was just King of the Jews. Now, if they had, well, let's look at what John 19:22 says. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek, the three common languages of that day. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, I am King of the Jews." And Pilate answered them, "What I have written, I have written." Now, Pilate didn't really believe that Jesus was King of the Jews. He probably insisted on the inscription as a means to mock the Jews because they desired to be liberated from Roman rule. Kind of like saying, "You desire to be liberated from us through your king? Well, here he is. We're killing him today." And then the Jews didn't want the placard because it was where they didn't believe who Jesus was, that he was called to be their king. And they rejected him. But Pilate overruled. God overruled. Kept it there. Kept the truth. The declaration of who Jesus really was over his cross. Now, if they would have followed the normal rules of what they would written, what would have been written on that sign about Jesus, it could have said something like this: "I'm dying because of what you did." It should have said something like, "You have sinned. People in the world have gossiped. They've had bad attitudes. They've stolen. They've lied. They've murdered. That's why I'm here." Those are the crimes for which Jesus was dying. He was dying for our crimes, our disobedience to God, because all of us have. All of us have sinned. And if they followed normal rules, that's what it should have said. But instead, it said who Jesus really was. Actual truth, absolute truth. He is the king, not only of the Jews, but of the universe, of the earth, of all nations of the earth. Also, when Jesus was crucified, two robbers were crucified with him at the same time. Two people who actually were guilty. They would have had that sign over their cross, over their crucifixion of what they actually did in Mark 15:27. It says, "And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left." I'll just read 27 there. One on his right and one on his left. These two guys were guilty. Also, fulfillment of Scripture. Isaiah 53:12. It says, "Therefore I will divide him a portion with many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and makes intercession for the transgressors." Now there is a place in Scripture where prophecy is not twofold. It's just a reference to a future to this one. He bore the sin of many. No one else besides Jesus has bore the sin of many. This is a prophecy about this one man, Jesus Christ, the promised one from the Old Testament. Bore the sins of many, and numbered with the transgressors. Again, written hundreds of years ago and fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. Back to our prophecy chart, Isaiah 53:12, fulfilled in Mark 15:27. Many things in these last hours of the life of Jesus Christ were fulfilled, having been written centuries before. Another reason that we have confidence in the Bible, predictions written so long ago and fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And the oldest actual copies of for example, the book of Isaiah, the oldest copies we have, even those copies we have before the life of Christ. Isaiah wrote, we have the evidence of what he wrote, and have proven that those documents were written well before the birth of Jesus Christ and fulfilled in his life. No one else fulfills these things. This is the uniqueness of Christianity. No other religious ruler has actually lived a perfect life and able to offer himself as a sacrifice and actually have died for the sins of many. That is the person of Jesus Christ. In Mark 15, 29 to 32, we're going to find Jesus here mocked and insulted while he was on the cross. Mark 15, 29 to 32 says, "And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, 'Ah, you who destroyed the temple and rebuilt it in 3 days. Save yourself, come down from the cross.' So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another." They were saying, "Come down now from the cross that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. So everybody who is not believing at this moment is mocking him, making fun of him, and referring to things that he had done and said in his life. "Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross," mocking him. He cannot save himself. He saved others, but didn't understand what Jesus was really about from this passage. Didn't believe him. Insulted. This was another thing that only could have happened because God permitted it. He could have not gone to the cross, spoken a word, and his enemies would fall dead. But these things happened because he permitted it, because he was doing something for the sake of others, receiving the punishment that someone else deserved, and that's you and I. And again, we have more words from another eyewitness of those accounts, from John, the Gospel of John, chapter 2. 13 to 21, it says, "The Passover of the Jews is at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." This is a reference to previously in Jesus' life. Sorry, I got confused for a second. A reference back to something that Jesus has said and what these people were saying about him. "The Passover of the Jews is at hand. Jesus went up to Jerusalem." This was probably a year or two before. "In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there, and making a whip of cords. He drove them out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. He poured out coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who sold the pigeons, 'Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade.' Don't be bringing business into the place where people come to worship God." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And the Jews said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body, a prophecy about being raised from the dead in 3 days. And these people were mocking him with, "Oh, this is what he said he would do, and let him come down from the cross, and he said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days," from verse 29. Not understanding what he was talking about. They were looking for a king that wasn't going to be. They were looking for a king that Jesus wasn't going to be. They wanted salvation from temporary circumstances. Jesus didn't come for that. He came to fix our real problem, our sin and our separation from God. Again, a prophecy fulfilled in Psalm 22, 6-8. It says, "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind, despised by the people. All who see me mock me, and they make mouths at me, and they wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him." Mocking him. Jesus trusted his Father. They mocked him about that. Didn't believe who he was. They saw miracles, and they rejected him on purpose. They were so focused on themselves, they rejected their Messiah, this promised one from their father Abraham, supposedly they say. Their hearts were far from God, hardened. Fulfilled again in Mark chapter 15, 29 to 32. Get our prophecy chart. Mocked and insulted. Jesus fulfilled this written hundreds of years before, actually almost 1,000 in that case in Psalms, fulfilled in Mark 15 in the last hours of Jesus. Jesus paid for sin by death. And we're gonna in just a minute here. We're gonna take we're gonna separate this lesson, and we're gonna stop this part of the lesson, and we're gonna continue on to the next right from this very point. But at this point, we've reached the most important event in all of human history. This is why this promised one has come to the earth. We need to understand that this is what God did so we could be delivered forever from Satan and his influence, from sin in our own lives. We don't have to live in that sin, in that separation from God now and forever. And we've been saved from an eternal separation from God through what is happening at this moment in our study 2,000 years ago, more or less. We need to remind ourselves of the punishment for sin. We need to remember, and this is the distinction of what Christianity is all about. God could never forgive and accept us unless the punishment of sin was completely paid. Death, separation from God. If God didn't. If God just forgave us and accepted us and didn't deal with the evil of sin, it would be saying that God's not really good, God's not really holy, and God declared that sin causes death, sin causes separation from me, and that separation is separation in spiritual death. Our relationship with God is we're separated from Him as a friend. We're separated from our body in physical death, our soul from our body. Our mind and our consciousness continues to go on, but we're separated from our physical body. God had a plan in place for us to live eternally on earth in our body, depending on Him, in fellowship and friendship with Him. And the last aspect of that separation forever in the lake of fire. And that is what will happen to everyone if sin isn't taken care of. And this is not a new concept in the life of Jesus. It's a concept that God communicated to Adam and Eve. You eat from this one tree, you do this one thing, you will die. Immediately. And they did immediately die. They were separated from God. And it would mean he would eventually die physically and eventually be separated from God forever in the place of torment because of rejecting God. And we need to realize our sin is more serious than we think it is. It's a bigger deal than we think it is. And God just can't forgive us just because He can. He has to also be right and just and holy, because that's who He is. And this is what Jesus came to do, to take care of this. Pay for sin by His own death in our place. He came to fix this problem. We've seen this before. That bridge between us and God was broken by sin. Jesus came to repair that problem. This is the biggest problem that we have, our separation from God. And this is the moment in history that we're studying, that the thing that Jesus came for, paying for sin by His own death. So we're going to take a break in this lesson, and we're going to just consider those things, and we're going to continue on, because we don't want to lose track of the gospel. The good news for us is the life of Jesus, the death of Jesus. He was buried. He rose from the dead. That is the whole message of our good news of the gospel. All of that together. You take one aspect out, and Christianity disappears, and its power and its value disappears. All that's included. That's the uniqueness of what Christianity is. It's centered around the focus on this one person, the person of Jesus Christ. And we're going to continue on in that in the second half of this lesson. Firm Foundations, Creation to Christ. We're going to go on and examining the details of these last moments of God fulfilling His plan to restore our relationship with Him.